Now, earlier this month, the BBC Today programme ran an item about the LGBT charity Stonewall. In particular, its controversial Diversity Champions training scheme for employers. Perhaps you've heard of it. Public bodies, from government departments to police forces, pay thousands of pounds for advice on gender-neutral spaces, on pronouns and trans inclusion. They get the equivalent of a gold star from Stonewall if they get things right. Problem is, a growing number of organisations are beginning to question if Stonewall is offering value for taxpayers' money and, more importantly, whether they've ignored the rights of feminists, women who hold gender-critical views. In other words, that being a woman is a biological fact. All this you may know. What you might not have heard was a debate on Radio 4 earlier this month. The producers had asked Stonewall to put up a representative. They didn't. Two gay contributors did make it, however. One upbraided the BBC presenter Justin Webb for not inviting a trans spokesperson to take part. Webb gave as good as he got, pointing out that his sexual preferences were a private matter, and he'd appreciate an answer to his original question. Thanks very much. These spats happen. They often make for quite engaging and sometimes instructive broadcasting. But what happened next is new and chilling, and you ought to take notice. Members of the BBC's Pride Board, which includes LGBT staff, met and decided activists should have a right to vet transgender news stories before they are broadcast. Deciding what should or shouldn't be said by journalists is a booming industry right now in China, but not normally in SW1. Further back, history is littered with religious sects who felt they, and only they, had alighted on the truth of something hitherto occluded. Insisting that only those who've experienced something can say anything about it is asinine. Journalism in the Western tradition at its best attempts to give everyone a voice. If staff at the BBC want to lobby and pressurise programme editors and presenters, perhaps they'd be better off doing it from outside the comforting embrace of the BBC licence fee. Well, Free Speech Nation presenter Andrew Doyle is here to think and ponder on that one. I come at this from the journalistic point of view, I suppose. Don't like the idea of caucuses within newsrooms telling me what to write. You probably see it a little bit differently, I guess.
No, I mean, I understand the point that when activists have a say in how journalism should run and what sort of questions should be asked, that is a problem because they're coming from a particular ideological slant. It's interesting that they invoke the idea of identity. It just goes to show how far identity politics has gone. But the trouble is that whenever someone takes that line and says, well, you don't have a right to have an opinion on this unless you're a member of the LGBT community, well, it will be perfectly easy to find someone of the LGBT community who has that opinion. And what do you do with your argument then? You're scuppered, aren't you? So I think identity politics, when it comes to argumentation, is a dead end. But that aside, the idea that activists within the BBC are saying that they should be able to vet certain elements of program. In other words, they should have some kind of editorial control over what goes on. That is a very bad idea because it's the kind of ideas that those activists themselves are promoting are the very ideas we need to scrutinise. And part of the problem with this movement at the moment, what we would call, I suppose, the woke movement, but in particular in relation to this story, those who advocate for the gender identity ideology, is that part of their strategy is to say that this is not up for debate.
It's settled. It's a settled topic. We've decided that it's definitive and can't be changed.
Exactly. So it's not like the question of gay marriage, which we had decades of protest and debate and persuasion, and we came to a resolution, and now the vast majority of people agree that...
and by the way, it's still possible to hold a contrary view.
And it still is possible, exactly. Even within that, it's perfectly legitimate to hold...
There are gay men who don't agree with gay marriage. I mean, that's still legitimate, you know.
There are indeed. But in this case, this is most certainly not a settled matter because no conversation has been allowed. I think that Stonewall, as we've seen, has got itself into hot water again and again. And one of their main problems is this refusal to debate. You know, when Matthew Parris, for instance, one of the co-founders of Stonewall, wrote an article critiquing its current trajectory, the Stonewall official Twitter account posted an image of the article and wrote, "You okay, hun?" which is a kind of teenage, snarky, dismissive comment. Now, when they keep doing things like that, when the head of Stonewall is likening gender-critical feminists to anti-Semites, what this does is it sends a message that they're not interested in people's concerns, not interested in people's criticisms. And people, the people who are running Stonewall presently, along with many of their supporters in the commentariat, tend to be interpreting any criticism or concern or question as evidence of hatred and transphobia. That is simply delusional. There might be, I know there are some transphobes out there, there are some hateful people who might be piping up at this time. The vast majority, the very idea that someone like Matthew Parris is a transphobe is so palpably absurd. It's also libelous, frankly.
Well, and also the idea that you want a thoughtful, considered voice like Matthew Parris to be silenced or curbed in some way is anathema to people who are interested in free expression. Just hold that thought for a second, because the BBC, we've asked for the BBC to give us a statement. They've given us one. Let me read it to you. They said, BBC News has full editorial independence and the meetings of staff networks do not determine editorial decisions. So that's fairly clear. Is there something in the nature, I wonder, Andrew, of the way the BBC works, is funded? You know, because of the licence fee, it's different from a newspaper. If you're in a newspaper, let's say I go and work for the Guardian, I toe the Guardian line, otherwise I don't get paid. Ditto the Telegraph or the Sun. At the BBC, because funding is guaranteed on pain of criminal prosecution, you can then get these caucuses and groups within the institution who are then free to lobby and pressurise for the agenda they so feel fit to pressurise for.
Yes, and one of the problems is, because the national broadcaster obviously has to maintain political impartiality, when it comes to these kinds of ideas, they do not perceive themselves, they think they're on the right side of history, they think that all of the stuff you've said is settled, but actually it does violate impartiality if you're pushing a particular side of this debate. Actually, there's a big conversation that needs to be had. With the BBC, as with many institutions, it doesn't take many from the sort of critical social justice ideology to get in for the whole institution to be dominated by it. And part of the reason for that is the tactics are often intimidatory. It's often a kind of bullying. I mean, if you're in the BBC at the moment and you're thinking, I've got some reservations about gender identity ideology, you're very unlikely to speak up. And I know this because I've spoken to people involved. You would be because you might jeopardise your career prospects. It's not just the BBC, and it's unfair to just sort of say it's them. This is in any institution where you have this contingent of activists present. And this is the problem, is that to argue against them, you have to argue against anyone, you have to have someone who is willing to argue, not someone who's just going to call you names and tell you that you're hateful and shut you down.
Yeah, and putting your head above the parapet, not just something restricted to the BBC, is it? There are other broadcasters maybe who feel that way as well. Andrew Doyle, hang around.